On January 23, 1897, Zona Heaster Shue was found dead in her home in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. It was thought she had died of natural causes, but a few weeks later, Zona visited her mother and told the awful tale of her murder. This is the true story of the Greenbrier Ghost.
Let's dig into this.
Like any good ghost story, there are a lot of different versions of the legend of the Greenbrier Ghost. We've sifted through dozens of the tales, and these, along with the newspaper accounts from the time, tell quite a tale.
Jacob and Mary Jane Heaster lived in the hills in rural Greenbrier County. They had 5 children, 4 boys, and a daughter named Elva, but called by her middle name Zona. In 1875, Zona was 21 or 22 years old, and legend says a night of moonshine and buggy rides with George Woolridge led Zona discovering she was pregnant. George was no gentleman and had no intention of marrying Zona and settling down with a child.
Claiming some other man could have been the father, George left town. Zona gave birth, and that is the last anyone heard about it. No one seems to know what happened to her baby. Maybe the child died, or maybe it was adopted. The only information researchers can find is the baby was born, and then vanishes from the records.
Erasmus Shue, sometimes named as Edward Shue in articles and reports, was called Trout by everyone. He came to Greenbrier in 1895. He was a blacksmith, at least 10 years older than Zona. He was tall, handsome, and very muscular. He had already been married twice, according to most reports. The gossip around the tiny community was that his last wife had only been 16 years old and had died just 6 months after their wedding, under mysterious circumstances. Some reports say the cause of her death was her husband dropping bricks or stones on her head when he was supposedly fixing the chimney in the middle of the night. There were also rumors that Trout's first wife had died falling off a haystack, and that Trout was a thief and had spent time in prison. They said he had a very short temper, too.
None of that mattered to Zona. She fell madly in love with Trout, and her mother was not happy about it. She tried to keep them apart. She didn't like Trout Shue, and she certainly didn't trust him. Zona married Trout anyway, and they lived in a 2-story farmhouse a short distance away from Louisburg. Everything seemed to be wonderful for the young couple, at least for the first 2 months or so.
Then Zona got sick in January of 1897. She was sick for weeks, and the local doctor, George W. Knapp, looked in on her often. No one knows what was wrong with Zona. Some folks suspected she was pregnant, while others thought she had contracted some terrible disease. Trout reportedly took care of his wife when he wasn't working.
On January 22, 1897, Trout stopped by the house of his neighbor known as Aunt Martha Jones on his way to work at the blacksmith's. He asked her to send her son Andy to his house to check on Zona and gather eggs because he didn't want her out in the cold. Aunt Martha said she would send Andy right over as soon as his other work was finished. Later reports said Trout came back to Aunt Martha's house 4 times before lunch to see if Andy had been to the house yet. He was angrier and more upset each time.
Early in the afternoon, Andy Jones finally went out to the Shue house and knocked on the door. There was no answer, so he poked his head in and shouted for Mrs. Shue. Still no answer. Since he had been asked to check on her, he started looking for her through the house. Legend says he found her at the bottom of the staircase with her head at a strange angle. Later newspaper reports showed Andy had found Zona laying in the dining room on the floor, and there was a trail of blood from the front door right to where she lay.
After finding Zona, Andy ran home yelling that Miss Shue was dead. His mother went with him to help get Trout and Dr. Knapp. By the time Aunt Martha and the doctor got to the Shue house, Trout had already carried Zona upstairs to the bedroom. He had dressed her in a high-collared dress and tied her favorite scarf around her neck. According to some reports, he also put a veil over her face and head. And Trout was sitting with Zona's head in his lap, crying uncontrollably.
Dr. Knapp did not find a pulse. Knowing Zona had been ill, he may have assumed she died of natural causes. And he didn't really examine her body because every time he tried to touch Zona, Trout would get even more upset. He listed everlasting faint as the cause of death on the death certificate. Later this would be changed, and childbirth was listed as the cause. Word was sent to Zona's parents of her death. Her mother, Mary Jane, reportedly said, "The devil has killed her," when she was told.
3 days later, Trout insisted on holding his wife's head during her wake. Some reports say when he wasn't holding her, he placed pillows on the side of her head. He said at the time it was to make her comfortable. People thought he was acting very strangely. He would pace up and down the room and sob and talk to himself. Some said later that Zona's head flopped and rolled in a strange way when her body was moved to her grave. Rumors started to fly about how poor Zona died.
And that might have been the end of the story if Mary Jane Heaster hadn't prayed and prayed for her daughter to return and tell her how she died. Soon Zona did return, and for 3 nights in a row she told her mother the story. The legend goes like this.
Zona told her mother Trout had come home from work one night and flown into a rage when there was no meat cooked for his supper. She said her muscular husband grabbed her by the throat and not only choked her, but tore ligaments and crushed her windpipe. Then he snapped her neck in 2. Mary Jane said Zona walked to the door and turned her head all the way around to her back to show her mother it was broken.
Mary Ann Heaster went to the authorities. The county prosecutor listened to her story, and although he didn't necessarily believe it, he started asking questions around town. And he found out a lot of people didn't think Zona died of natural causes at all. Dr. Knapp said he couldn't examine the body because of the strange way Trout was acting in his extreme grief. Others told him they thought they had seen Zona with bruises before, and maybe even after she died. And that was enough for the prosecutor to have Zona Shue's body exhumed.
An autopsy was scheduled. As Zona's next of kin, Trout was required by law to be there. He objected quite loudly to them digging up his wife's grave. He also reportedly said he knew he was going to be arrested, but no one could prove he killed his wife.
Zona was exhumed on March 9th, more than a month after she was buried. Trout Shue, County Prosecutor Preston, and a few other people were present. Young Andy Jones was reportedly there as well. The autopsy was performed by Dr. Knapp and 2 other physicians. Newspapers reported that poor Zona had finger marks on her throat, her windpipe was crushed, ligaments were torn, and her neck was broken between the 1st and 2nd vertebrae, just like her ghost had said.
Trout Shue was arrested and charged with his wife's murder. His former mother-in-law, Mary Jane Heaster, took the stand at the trial and told the jury in a calm manner that her daughter had come to her 3 times to tell her story of her own death. Mary Jane was able to describe things she had never seen before on the stand. She described her daughter's home perfectly, even though she had never been there. She was a very good witness.
It took the jury 70 minutes to reach their verdict. Trout Shue was found guilty and given a life sentence at the West Virginia State Prison. He died there when an epidemic broke out in 1900. The case is the only one known where the testimony of ghostly visitation truly helped convict a murderer, and the ghost of Zona Heaster Shue never visited her mother again.
We hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe.
And we'll see you on the next one.